St. Petersburg, on the banks of the Neva. On one side, the major industrial city with its port and factories. On the other, the ancient capital of the Russian Empire with its monuments and palaces, including the famous Winter Palace. Up until the 1917 revolution, it was the palace of the Tsar of all Russia. The emblem of his absolute power, the crowned double-headed eagle, has been renovated and returned after a long absence. On the palace square, other eagles await their renovation, covered in plastic, as if to stay protected against the next storm. Across the city is one of those little museums to the glory of the Great Revolution, like many others during the 73 years of Soviet rule. In a storage room, a painting of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, the founding father, sits side by side with one of the writer Maxim Gorky, famous for his political activities and stark descriptions of Russia's lower classes. Lenin was head of the Bolshevik branch of the Russian Social Democratic Party, the drive behind the 1917 revolution. Gorky was his main witness and troubled conscience. The writer and the leader. Soviet legend celebrates their friendship. Yet there is only one photo of just the two of them. And that image is a fake, heavily retouched in the 30s on Stalin's orders. Gorky and Lenin weren't alone when it was taken. They were surrounded by delegates of the Second Congress of the Communist International that took place in 1920. But some delegates had been eliminated during the major Stalinist purges, and the remaining were erased for good measure. Two years after having posed with Lenin, Gorky is asked to leave the Soviet Union. Officially, he went abroad to heal his sick lungs. In reality, he was taking Lenin's friendly yet forceful advice. It was an exile in all but name. For some time, he wandered through Europe before finally laying down his 20 archive-filled suitcases in a villa in Sorrento, southern Italy, across from Vesuvius. It was not chance that had brought him to Sorrento. Gorky had lived on the nearby Isle of Capri for several years, already in exile from the Tsar following the failed 1905 revolution in which he had played an important role. It was during this first exile that the world-famous writer had grown close to the Bolsheviks, financing their secret activities, receiving militants and leaders in Capri. Lenin at Gorky's house in 1908, playing chess with Bogdanov, his main opponent in the party. Then, they say, playing with Gorky himself, a mythical game that Gorky won in 24 moves. Ten years passed between the two exiles, of 1908 and the 20s, and a war and a revolution. War broke out in Europe in 1914. On the one side was Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. On the other, France, Britain, and their ally, Russia. A huge but archaic country at the whim of the despotic Tsar. The war exposed their rulers' carelessness and fragility. 3 years of military defeats, political and social repression, and poverty. In February 1917, revolution broke out. Following an International Women's Day protest, famished riots flared across the imperial city known as Petrograd since 1914, a Russian version of St. Petersburg, which was considered too German. Most of the 300,000 soldiers in the local garrison sided with the rioters. The Tsar's regime was overthrown in the course of 4 days. Having been amnestied at the start of the war, Gorky returned to Petrograd as early as 1914. He lived in an Art Nouveau building on Kronversky Prospect, at the heart of it all. With the main leaders in prison or exile, Gorky was the revolution's figurehead. He knew people across the capital, and he had a telephone. His apartment became the movement's impromptu headquarters. Everyone came there to get the latest news. Gorky himself rarely went out. He watched from afar, fascinated by what was happening in the park across the avenue. Most surprisingly of all, the great writer wasn't writing. In February 1917, he was happy just to take notes, which he stored in envelopes for later on. Later on would be 1924 during his exile in Sorrento. Only then would he return to his notes to write a series of sketches that he himself called Reminiscences of the Revolution.
Le Jardinier, février 1917. Les automobiles foncent dans la rue. Hurlements de moteurs, fracas de ferraille, éclaboussant de boue les murs et les passants. Soldats et marins s'y entassent. Les aiguilles d'acier de leurs baïonnettes ressemblant au piquant d'un hérisson géant et enragé. De temps en temps, on entend les claquements secs des coups de fusil. La révolution a commencé et le peuple russe est en mouvement. Il court comme s'il essayait d'attraper la liberté, comme si la liberté pouvait être ailleurs qu'en lui-même. Dans le parc, un jardinier travaille. Il est seul, ratissant calmement les allées. L'agitation folle de la rue ne l'intéresse pas. Il semble ne pas entendre les chants, les détonations, ne pas voir les drapeaux rouges. Je le regarde. J'attends le moment où il lèvera la tête et verra les voitures étincelant de baïonnettes. Mais il garde la tête baissée, travaillant obstinément comme une taupe, et aussi aveugle qu'elle.
The rallying point for the protesters and insurgent soldiers was one of Petrograd's most beautiful palaces, the Tauride Palace, the seat of the Duma, a parliament with no real power, Emperor Nicholas II's only concession to democracy after 1905's failed revolution. There, in Catherine the Great's hall, the insurgent soldiers and sailors came to pledge allegiance to the revolution's two authorities. On the one hand, the provisional government bringing together representatives of the political opposition from the former Duma. On the other, there was the Soviet, a large people's assembly where revolutionaries voted by a show of hands. With a majority of soldiers, the Soviet's first decree, its first order of business, and one with many consequences, was to free them of their duty to obey officers. Though dominated by revolutionary parties, the Soviet remained divided. Socialist revolutionaries were in the majority, but were split between the moderate and more radical. And there was the great Marxist tribe, dominated by the Mensheviks, which subdivided into Mensheviks on the right and the international Mensheviks to the left. Finally came the Bolsheviks, the smallest Marxist faction, but also the most radical. Their leader was Lenin, the big absentee of those February days. He was in exile, trapped in Switzerland by the war, unable to return to Russia. He learnt of the Tsar's abdication from the papers, and also that his own Soviet Revolutionary Party supported the provisional government. The compromise infuriated him, but there was little he could do from 2,500 kilometers away other than write to Petrograd what he himself called letters from far away.
The provisional government, this bourgeois government, wants to pursue the imperialist war until its end. The proletariat cannot and should not support this war government. We need to arm the people under the workers' guidance so they might directly take power.
These letters were intended for publication in the party newspaper, Pravda, which was headed by two militants back from exile, Kamenev and Stalin. Unlike Lenin, they supported the provisional government, were against taking power, and quickly buried Lenin's letters. In the last of these letters, Lenin criticized Gorky directly.
I read in the papers that Maxim Gorky spoke enthusiastically before the provisional government, inviting them to crown their act of liberation by making peace. But not peace at any cost. Peace that will allow Russia to keep its honor amid the other countries of the world. It is with deep chagrin that one reads his words impregnated with stock Philistine prejudices. When we met on the Isle of Capri, I reproached him for his political mistakes. Gorky is an enormous artistic talent which has been and will be of great benefit to the world proletarian movement. But why should Gorky meddle in politics?
These were the two faces of the February Revolution. On the one hand, the huge bursts of mass anger, burning prisons and courts, destroying police archives, hunting down the regime's agents. On the other, the calm crowds, celebrating the abolition of privileges, the insurgent soldier smiling, his bayonet pointed at the imperial eagle, covered simply with a red flag. St. Petersburg's Finland Station, with its banal Soviet-era architecture. But on the quay is a surprising portico. It's the old station's portico that has been fully preserved inside the new building amid the concrete, like a holy relic of Leninism. It was here that Lenin finally returned to Petrograd in April 1917 and began his march to power. Barely off the train, Lenin shunned the moderate Soviet officials who had come to greet him, haranguing his own partisans instead.
A Soviet run by opportunists, social patriots, can only be an instrument of the bourgeoisie. For to serve the global socialist revolution, the Soviet must be conquered and become proletarian. Let us not recognize the necessity of a bourgeois government. We don't need a parliamentary republic, a bourgeois democracy. We don't need any government other than the Soviet. All power to the Soviet.
The first May 1st for liberated Russia, International Workers' Day. This was the symbolic day that Gorky chose to bring out the first issue of the newspaper that he had just created, as if Lenin's return had pushed him to be more politically active. The title was Novaya Zhizn, New Life, with a 2 million print run that would make it the most read daily in Russia from April 1917 to July 1918. Resolutely Marxist, the slogan over the masthead was taken from the Communist Manifesto, "Workers of the world, unite." But the newspaper was bound to no party and was opposed both to the right, the provisional government, and to the Bolsheviks' more extreme positions. Gorky stopped providing long articles, contributing instead short op-eds called Untimely Thoughts.
25 avril 1917. Les justes de tous bords me clouent au pilori. Naturellement généreux, je me dois de leur donner des raisons supplémentaires de me brûler sur le bûcher de leurs discours enflammés. Depuis 17 ans, je me considère comme un social-démocrate et j'ai servi les grands desseins de ce parti dans la mesure de mes forces. Mais partout, je me sens un hérétique. On trouvera sans doute beaucoup de contradictions dans mes opinions politiques. Ces contradictions, je ne peux ni ne veux les concilier. Car pour la tranquillité de mon âme, il me faudra alors tuer cette part de mon âme qui, passionnément et douloureusement, aime l'homme russe vivant, pécheur, pitoyable. Et voilà. J'en ai dit assez pour que les justes puissent me traiter de tous les noms.
The charms of the old regime. The ballerina Mathilde Kushasinska, mistress of Russia's last emperor Nicholas II. No sooner had she fled Russia on February 27th than the Bolsheviks had occupied her magnificent mansion and made it their headquarters. Later, the mansion became the Museum of the Revolution, and when the revolution went out of fashion, it became the Museum of Political History of Russia. It includes a fanatically accurate reconstruction of Lenin's office, where he resumed work on the very evening of his return, taking back control of the party. A little more kitsch, this plate painted in the 30s, showing a smiling Stalin who has come to greet Lenin as he descends from the train. And another plate with the inscription, "Whoever is not with us is against us," Lenin's slogan, borrowed from St. Matthew. Applying it literally and refusing any concession or compromise, in just a few weeks Lenin was able to take back the party and to impose his hardline against moderates, Kamenev, and Stalin.
Russia is now the freest country in the world. Propaganda is the most effective tool to push forward a listless revolution. We are still a minority in the Soviet. We must become the majority. To explain the proletarian program, to denounce petty bourgeois politics and support for the provisional government, to pursue propaganda and agitation throughout all the regiments and all the factories, and to organize again and again the proletariat neighborhood by neighborhood, factory by factory.
Separated from the imperial city by the Neva and the canals, in 1917 these factories employed 400,000 workers. The slogans called them the revolution's spearhead, but in reality, it was the disintegrating economy, unemployment, the rising cost of living, and supply problems that were creating famine. And while the Soviet promised a social revolution, it did nothing to achieve it. In the countryside, the earth still belonged to the major landowners, and the much hoped-for agrarian reform was stillborn. Finally, there was the army. Petrograd's garrison alone counted 300,000 soldiers. They made the revolution. Most of them came from the peasantry and wanted the seizure and redistribution of land, but not its collectivization. They wanted the end of the war, but without betraying their comrades at the front. Because for better or worse, the war against Germany continued. Contested by the soldier committees and paralyzed by the Soviets' First Order, military leaders were unable to impose discipline. In May and June, as harvest approached, the desertions became frequent.
9 juin 1917. Un lecteur m'écrit. Un soldat m'a dit qu'il était déserteur parce qu'il devait s'occuper de ses 2 jeunes enfants que sa femme, la salope, avait abandonnés. À cause des femmes, les soldats désertent par centaines de milliers. Comment résoudre ce problème? Un groupe de paysans m'écrit. Nous vous prions de nous dire comment comprendre l'égalité officiellement proclamée entre les femmes et nous. Les paysans sous-signés s'inquiètent d'une loi qui peut avoir pour résultat un accroissement de l'illégalité maintenant que le village ne tient plus que sur les femmes. La famille est abolie, ce sera la ruine de l'agriculture. Un groupe de soldats m'écrit. Il y a de plus en plus de cas de soldats trompés par leurs femmes qui leur font subir un châtiment bestial. Usez, s'il vous plaît, de votre influence pour que la presse sociale dénonce ce phénomène et montre que les femmes ne sont pas les vrais coupables. On me demande que faire des pop, comment soigner la syphilis, d'envoyer des brochures sur les droits des femmes. Toutes ces questions ne trouvent pas de réponse dans nos journaux enferrés dans leurs querelles venimeuses. Leurs éditeurs oublient qu'il existe en dehors du cercle de leur influence des dizaines de millions d'hommes qui sentent s'éveiller en eux le désir profond d'édifier de nouvelles formes de vie. Ne pas leur répondre, c'est les mépriser. Et c'est une erreur terrible.
As much as social issues, the matter of the war became crucial to the revolution. Pushed by the Allies, the provisional government and the army wished to see the war through. Until the final victory, the banners said, demanding that Lenin be sent back to Germany. Lenin the traitor, who dared call for an immediate and unconditional peace. These patriots had a new hero, the War Minister Kerensky, a socialist revolutionary already named the Russian Bonaparte by his followers. That June, to help reclaim the army and affirm the provisional government, Kerensky set off a mass offensive against the Germans. It proved disastrous. The Germans rebuffed the attack and in return advanced over hundreds of kilometers. The Russian losses were tremendous, 40,000 dead, 10,000 prisoners. And the failure gave new life to Lenin's commands, which were then brandished at every protest against the provisional government. Down with the capitalist ministers, Soviet power for all, or as a Bolshevik sailor called out to the moderate Soviet president Chezhde, take the power, son of a bitch, since we've given it to you.
27 juin 1917. Un honorable citoyen m'écrit « L'âme est saisie d'effroi lorsqu'on entend dans les meetings de rue des soldats défendre les slogans extrémistes des léninistes et qu'on les voit par ailleurs céder si facilement à la propagande antisémite qui dénonce la mainmise juive sur le soviet. » J'ai demandé à un soldat comment il conciliait ces deux attitudes. Il m'a dit « Nous sommes des gens sans instruction, ce n'est pas à nous de débrouiller des problèmes aussi compliqués. » Un autre lecteur m'écrit « Un conducteur de tramway à qui j'ai dit que les socialistes luttaient pour l'égalité de tous les peuples m'a répondu « On s'en fout de vos socialistes. Le socialisme, c'est une invention de riches. Nous, les ouvriers, nous sommes bolcheviques. »
The naval fortress Kronstadt on Kotlin Island. It protects the Neva estuary. During the winter, it's possible to walk the 20 miles to Petrograd over the frozen sea. In 1917, Kronstadt was the base for the Baltic Flotilla and the core of revolutionary fervor. As early as May, Kronstadt's Soviet rejected the authority of the provisional government, and the sailors, mostly Bolsheviks or anarchists, regularly set off for Petrograd, where they'd serve as commandos during protests, terrorizing the bourgeois. Lenin relied upon them, even for his conflicts with other Bolsheviks. When he felt that he might be in the minority, he would claim to abandon the party and his opponents and go, as he'd put it, to the Navy. This flag says, "Death to the bourgeois."
Chaque jour, mon angoisse monte et je crains que la politique délirante de Lénine nous conduise bientôt à la guerre civile. Il est totalement isolé, mais ses slogans sont très populaires parmi les masses d'ouvriers sans instruction et une partie des soldats. L'État russe craque à toutes ses jointures et se disloque comme une vieille péniche par grande crue.
All through the month of June, Lenin played his double game. He'd provoke the provisional government with his calls to the masses, and he'd seek to hold back these same masses in order to control the tempo of the revolution.
The slightest mistaken initiative on our behalf can bring everything down. It is naive to think that we'd keep power if we could take it today. But even in the Soviets of both capitals, we are in complete minority, not to mention everywhere. We shouldn't anticipate the course of events, but time is on our side.
But things got out of control on July 4th, as 300,000 pro-Bolshevik protesters marched on the Tauride Palace, despite the calls for peace of the Bolshevik leaders. At the crossroads of Sadovskaya and Nevsky Prospect, sympathizers of the provisional government and the moderate Soviet opened fire on the protesters, leaving 100 dead.
Les images de la folie qui s'est emparée de Petrograd dans l'après-midi du 4 juillet resteront gravées dans la mémoire. Hérissé de fusils et de mitrailleuses comme un porc furieux, voici que passe un camion où s'entassent les représentants hétéroclites de l'armée révolutionnaire. L'un d'eux hurle « La révolution sociale, camarades !» Des gens qui n'ont pas encore perdu la tête, sans armes, arrêtent le monstre et lui arrachent sa crête de fusil. Les soldats et les matelots désarmés se mêlent à la foule. Le grotesque véhicule, vidé de son contenu, disparaît lui aussi comme un cauchemar. Soudain, un coup de feu claque, et les gens par centaines s'égayent convulsivement. Chassés par la peur, ils roulent par terre, se culbutent les uns les autres, en criant « Les bourgeois qui tirent !» Naturellement, ce ne sont pas les bourgeois. Ce n'est pas par peur de la révolution qu'on tire, c'est par peur pour la révolution. Beaucoup trop d'entre nous sont habités par cette peur. Toutefois, les principaux responsables du drame, ce ne sont ni les léninistes, ni les contre-révolutionnaires. Le principal responsable, l'ennemi le plus pernicieux et le plus puissant, c'est l'épaisse stupidité russe.
The day after the shooting, the provisional government started their hunt for Bolsheviks. Troops disarmed and arrested the militants, occupied and ransacked their headquarters, but narrowly missed Lenin, who had been there just a few hours earlier. Lenin was officially accused of being a German spy, and an arrest warrant was put out. Fearing for his life, he decided to go underground, hidden by the party in the apartment of a militant who would later be Stalin's father-in-law. Another museum. A young Stalin. Stalin in 1917. Lenin shared the room with Zinoviev, one of his main political opponents on the Central Committee, also in hiding. Lenin had the bed, Zinoviev had the couch. In the evening, they'd put up a screen between the adversaries. In the old bathroom, the showstopper. The razor that Stalin used to shave Lenin to disguise him. Clean-shaven and wearing a wig, Lenin was photographed for his identity papers. The only portrait of him that we have for the whole of 1917. In the museum's little office, a photo of the barber, taken in the 50s, is used for a calendar.
Désormais, la contre-révolution n'est plus une expression, mais un fait. Les bolcheviks sont exterminés dans les rues comme des rats, mais est désormais traité de bolchevique quiconque parle de contre-révolution.
Out of revolutionary solidarity, the leftist groups refused to join the anti-Bolshevik bloodletting and were then called to leave the Tauride palace that they'd occupied since February. They fell back on the Smolny Institute, a former school for girls of the nobility established by Catherine the Great. Having become head of the provisional government, Kerensky also moved. Showing his ambitions, he chose the Winter Palace, the former imperial palace where he naturally took the fallen emperor's office. But Kerensky had competition to his right, the General Kornilov, a Republican soldier and strongman close to the officers and the bourgeois who hoped he would re-establish order. At the end of August 1917, Kornilov launched a coup. He called his soldiers, the feared Savage Division, back from the front to march on Petrograd. But other officers of other sections did not follow suit. After a long period of hesitation, Kerensky denounced the counter-revolution and called the Soviet to his aid. The Bolsheviks were rehabilitated as the only ones able to rally the masses. Petrograd had become a city under siege, protected by hundreds of thousands of armed men, soldiers, and workers' militias. Railroad workers sabotaged the train lines, leaving Kornilov's Savage Division 100 kilometers out of the city. The delegates of Soviet's Petrograd were then able to contact the soldiers involved in the coup and bring them over to their cause. The Savage Division laid down their weapons. The coup failed without a fight. And all the while, Gorky remained silent. While New Life had been calling on all to defend the revolution against Kornilov, accusing Kerensky of collaborating with the treacherous general, there had been no word from Gorky. No article either when the newspaper was banned in retribution and had to publish some issues under another name. No one knows why he kept silent. But during this period, Gorky was not in Petrograd. He was at a resort in the Crimea, involved in a complicated love affair. "2,000 kilometers to the north, Lenin was also absent from the city. Still wanted, still clandestine. He was hiding on the banks of Lake Lakhta, near the Finnish border. For a while, he lived in a straw hut that is now a museum. The Hut Museum, or rather, Two Hut Museum, because right next to the fragile hut, a second one was built, made of granite. Contrary to Gorky, Lenin never stopped writing while in his countryside, bombarding Petrograd with orders and articles at a steady pace, all on the lone theme of taking power. Near the huts are 2 logs they say he used as a desk. His green desk. Along with other articles, that's where he may have written the one titled The Root of Evil, which took as its target the Menshevik leftist Nikolai Sukhanov, of whom there remains only this mugshot taken by the Tsar's police.
Everyone will probably agree that the writer N. Sukhanov of Novaya Zizin is one of the best rather than worst representatives of petty bourgeois democracy. He sincerely leans toward internationalism, yet he is entirely wrong on the main issue in thinking that the will of the people alone can triumph. Both from March to April and from July to August 1917, most resolutions were for the Soviets. The majority of the people were for the Soviets. Yet everyone sees, knows, and feels that from March to April, the revolution was moving forward, whereas from July to August, it was moving backwards. Consequently, reference to the majority of the people decides nothing as far as the specific issues of a revolution are concerned. It's a petty bourgeois illusion. What is needed is the strength of the revolutionary classes that will and can fight, a strength which at the decisive moment and place will crush the enemy's strength.
This force that was ready to overthrow the provisional government was the Red Guard and the pro-Bolshevik soldiers. The failure of Kornilov's putsch gave them fresh momentum, and even more so the weapons that Kerensky had been at such pains to take from them. Against them, Kerensky could only count on student officers and a battalion of women soldiers. It was at this decisive moment that Kerensky made a major mistake. At a time when the 300,000 men of the Petrograd garrison were still uncommitted, on September 20th, he ordered part of them to leave for the front. The soldiers refused and joined the Bolsheviks. They then only had to put into practice what Marx had called the art of insurrection, seizing the bridges, post offices, telephone communications, and thus deprive the provisional government of all means of communication with the troops on the front that were still loyal. The October Revolution and its legends. A model reconstruction of the cruiser Aurora, resting on a structure of tubes and pipes, offered to the director of Petrograd's waterworks by Soviet plumbers. The full-scale Aurora is forever anchored on the Neva as both a museum and monument. On October 25, 1917, a cannon shot by this cruiser that had come from Kronstadt served as the signal for the insurrection that overthrew the provisional government and gave full power to the Soviets, in appearance at least, as in reality the Bolsheviks and they alone took power and would keep it for the following 70 years. But at the moment, Lenin had to break up the state apparatus that had been resisting the coup, striking government workers, closed ministries.
Laborers and peasants, workers and exploited ones, you are now in charge of the state. Your Soviets are now the organisms of state power, endowed with full authority. Set yourself to the task without awaiting anyone further.
In reality, Lenin was pursuing his twofold strategy. In parallel with his widespread appeals, with their anarchistic overtones, the Bolshevik Party's dictatorship was establishing itself as early as October 25th through censorship of the press, the ban of newspapers labeled bourgeois, and the widespread arrests of opponents. At the summit was undivided power. At the bottom was the myth of the Soviets and of sharing without ruling power.
10 novembre 1917. Adresse aux ouvriers. Vladimir Lénine introduit le socialisme en Russie selon la méthode du nihiliste Netchaïev, à toute vapeur à travers le marais. Il travaille comme un chimiste dans son laboratoire, à ceci près que le chimiste utilise un matériau mort et obtient des résultats précieux pour la vie, tandis que Lénine travaille sur un matériau vivant et conduit la révolution à sa mort. 7 décembre 1917. Depuis 2 semaines, chaque nuit, des foules pillent les celliers à vin, se saoulent, se battent à coups de bouteilles. Pendant ces pillages, des hommes sont abattus comme des loups furieux. Exterminer froidement son prochain devient une pratique courante. Tout ceci marque le triomphe de cette sauvagerie asiatique qui nous pourrit intérieurement. C'est de l'anarchisme zoologique, une révolte russe sans vrai socialiste.
The same December 7th, the Bolshevik militant Felix Dzerzhinsky, who had been to prison under the Tsar's regime, was named by the Council of the People's Commissars to create an emergency commission for combating counter-revolution and sabotage, the Cheka. It was through a brief in Izvestia, providing the office's hours and address, that the general public learned of the creation of this political police that would track down, arrest, and then eliminate the opponents, be they partisans of Kerensky or moderate revolutionaries. As for simple bourgeois, for the moment it was still enough to commandeer them into snow-clearing duty.
It would be completely stupid and absurdly utopian to believe that the passage from capitalism to socialism is conceivable without state violence, without dictatorship. But dictatorship is a big word that shouldn't be used lightly. Dictatorship is an iron discipline, a government of revolution that quickly and mercilessly crushes saboteurs and thugs. We must sadly recognize that our government is still too timid, more marshmallow than iron. Those wallowing in the new life's hypocritical Menshevik hysteria do not understand this.
Just a year earlier, they had been digging up the bones of the first Russian revolutionaries in order to pay homage to them. Republican and Democratic insurgents who, defeated, had been caught and executed by the Tsarist regime in 1826. Osip Mandelstam had dedicated a poem to them and the sweetness of liberty. But Mandelstam's democratic idealism was outmoded by January 1918. A different poet, Alexander Blok, embodied this new phase of the revolution with his poem The 12, telling of the wild nighttime ride of a Red Guard patrol through the streets of Petrograd during a blizzard.
Camarade, tiens le fusil sans peur. Flanquons une balle à la Sainte Russie, la matoise, la Russie des Isbas au gros cul. Pour le malheur de tous les bourgeois, un incendie mondial nous allumerons, un incendie mondial plein de sang, et que Dieu nous bénisse. S'amuser n'est pas un péché. Fermez vos portes, il y aura aujourd'hui du pillage. Ouvrez vos caves, les gueux font aujourd'hui la noce. Un jour de 1919, Alexandre Blok m'a parlé de son essai « Le naufrage de l'humanisme ». Je n'arrivais pas à comprendre si ce naufrage l'attristait ou le réjouissait. Il était comme un enfant dans la nuit qui, sentant des monstres s'approcher, balbutie des exorcismes incohérents dans l'espoir qu'ils prendront peur et le laisseront tranquille. Puis, il est parti dans une diatribe contre le flottement des intellectuels vis-à-vis des principes bolcheviques et a dit justement « Les intellectuels ont invoqué l'esprit de destruction du fond des ténèbres, alors qu'ils ne viennent pas nous dire maintenant, cette destruction, ce n'est pas nous, c'est les autres là-bas. Le bolchevisme, c'est leur œuvre. Un peu après, j'ai reçu la visite d'un marin de Kronstadt venu m'emprunter un livre. Il m'a dit, il paraît qu'un savant américain a inventé une machine toute simple, un télescope, une manivelle, une roue. On tourne la manivelle et on peut tout voir. Analyse, trigonométrie, critique. La machine vous montre toute l'histoire de l'humanité et en plus, elle siffle. Ce que j'aime le plus dans sa machine, c'est qu'elle siffle.
The Communist Utopia. A 1924 film showed the Bolsheviks leaving for Mars, carrying the revolution with them to free Martian workers from the capitalists there. That was also the main challenge facing Lenin and other Bolshevik leaders in January 1918, to export Russia's revolution and turn it into a global one, forever abolishing capitalism and imperialism. Bolshevik hopes rested foremost on Germany and Austria. They hoped that their revolution would continue there before spreading across Europe. Yet despite the scenes of German and Russian soldiers fraternizing, and despite the strikes that broke out in Vienna and Berlin that January, the much-awaited storm did not break out. And Bolshevik Russia found itself alone, encircled to the east and south by counter-revolutionary forces and to the west by the German army. In February, Germany broke the armistice and launched a new offensive. The Russian army collapsed. The Bolshevik Party's left wing wanted to proclaim a revolutionary war and fight to the end. But a realistic Lenin pushed for acceptance, and on March 3, 1918, the Russian negotiators signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that brought peace, though with humiliating conditions and tremendous territorial losses. Lenin himself qualified the treaty as shameful, but when New Life dared call it a capitulation, it was banned for a few days.
16 mars 1918. Une partie de notre intelligentsia s'est convertie à l'idée pernicieuse d'une singularité russe et à une semi-adoration sentimentale pour le peuple élevé dans la servitude, l'alcoolisme et les sombres superstitions de l'Église. Ce peuple, opprimé jusqu'à l'hébétude, faible, ignorant et porté à l'anarchisme, est maintenant appelé à être le Messie de l'Europe. Cette curieuse idée sentimentale ne gêne pas les commissaires du peuple. Ils veulent allumer avec le bois humide russe un brasier qui éclairerait le monde occidental. Ils ont allumé ce feu. Il brûle mal et répand en Russie une odeur infecte de crasse, d'ivresse et de cruauté. Et l'on traîne et l'on pousse sur ce Golgotha la pauvre Russie pour la crucifier au nom du salut du monde. N'est-ce pas du messianisme à 100 à l'heure?
The glorious locomotive number 293 that had brought Lenin back to Petrograd in April 1917 is now exposed in a glass case in Finland Station. There is no monument, however, to commemorate the train number 4001, upon which Lenin and the Council of the People's Commissars left Petrograd for Moscow in March 1918, afraid that the Germans, just 2 days from the city, might take it despite the peace treaty. The journey happened by night, under the protection of Bolshevik soldiers, leaving from a freight station which doesn't even have a name today. The evacuation was kept secret until the last moment and was considered a real betrayal by the leftist workers and Bolsheviks. Many of them considered this day the end of the revolution. And something seemed to break for Gorky too, as if he'd lost his only intermediary when Lenin left.
Tout le monde fuit d'ici, à pied, à cheval, en train. Dans la rue gisent des chevaux crevés, les chiens les rongent, les habitants se promènent en enviant les chiens. Les enfants meurent beaucoup. Que me reste-t-il à dire? Tout est si détestable et nauséabond que je n'ai plus envie de parler de rien.
The last independent newspaper, New Life, was permanently suppressed on July 16th, the same day that the emperor and his family were executed in Yekaterinburg in the Urals, just as counter-revolutionary troops were poised to take the city and free them. Civil war and famine were widespread, and the workers' revolt was stirring again. As anti-Bolshevik attacks increased, Lenin retaliated with the Red Terror, summary executions of thousands of opponents. And Gorky was condemned to be no more than a silent witness, taking notes and filing them away for later in envelopes.
La ville est accablée de chaleur, frappée de stupeur, enterrée dans un silence interrompu seulement par instant par une vague de sons délirants. Une voix de fausset chante plaintive dans le ruisseau d'argent, dans le sable doré. Je cherche les traces d'une belle demoiselle. Une voix rauque l'interrompt. Qu'est-ce que tu as fait ce matin? Un peu de tir. Combien? 3. Ils sont hurlés? Non, pourquoi? Tu veux dire qu'ils se laissent faire sans réagir? Oui. Ils sont disciplinés à leur façon. Ils savent qu'ils se sont attirés des ennuis et qu'ils doivent payer. Des nobles? Non. Ils se sont signés devant la fosse. Des gens normaux. Un moment de silence. Puis la chanson reprend. Lune brillante, guide-moi. Tu as tiré, toi aussi? Oui, pourquoi pas? La voix rauque se fait moqueuse. Tu chantes « Oh, ma belle demoiselle », mais tu es obligé de recoudre ta chemise toi-même, crétin. Attends un peu. Les filles finiront par arriver aussi, quand il sera temps. Tout finira par arriver. Tout. Oh, douce brise, dis-moi, à quoi la belle peut bien rêver?